The last major independent interview he did, in other words, with journalists, not just his own MAGA allies on streaming, was with the NABJ. And there is some news coming out of Harris' podcast interview tonight. She did this big, unusual appearance with someone named Alex Cooper. And if you don't know her, I can tell you a heck of a lot of people do. She recently signed a $125 million deal with Sirius, which gives you an idea of her value according to media companies in today's ecosystem. Her 10 million person audience for her show beats, frankly, most political programming. She's kind of like the new Howard Stern. The show is called Call Her Daddy, and it reaches a young audience that skews female. So Harris and her campaign are doing this quite deliberately. It's a different kind of interview, which is also a window into the issues that may be breaking through for that audience. Cooper asking about J.D. Vance's attacks on women who do not have kids.
J.D. Vance called women who don't have kids childless cat ladies. What message do you think this sends to women who cannot conceive or just don't want kids?
I just think it's mean and mean-spirited. And I think that most Americans want leaders who understand that the measure of their strength is not based on who you beat down. The real measure of the strength of a leader is based on who you lift up.
The governor of Arkansas said, "My kids keep me humble." Unfortunately, Kamala Harris doesn't have anything keeping her humble.
There are a whole lot of women out here who, one, are not aspiring to be humble.
That's just some of that conversation, which is interesting, a little different. The interview is part of the broader series of interviews that include now, this week, the original king of radio I mentioned, Howard Stern. Now, he's hosted the president earlier this year. He's been vocally supportive of this Democratic ticket. So that's the Howard Stern interview Harris is doing coming up, plus The View, The Late Show with Colbert, and a whole Univision town hall. Now, Harris' allies view this blitz that I'm telling you about as kind of a twofer. She'll reach tens of millions of people beyond the political bubble. It's also, they think, a meta demonstration that the vice president can take all kinds of questions in all kinds of forums, rebutting the GOP talking point that suggested she wasn't doing enough interviews, while, of course, Trump ducks, which we'll get to. But the other dynamic, before I turn to that, is how this campaign wants to showcase Kamala Harris's strengths. Remember, she came into this later than any nominee ever. And while she is the vice president, as I mentioned, plenty of people don't follow everything. So they want to find ways to continue to introduce her to people who follow politics less. And that means finding forums that work. Remember, Bill Clinton crushed town halls. It was his thing. His campaign was psyched to get one of the first presidential debates in that format. So they got a debate with all the energy and televised audience that brings, with Clinton talking to people in that format. Obama was better at big speeches, and the campaign prioritized them. Harris has connected with people for her kind of fun and off-the-cuff vibe. And so they're looking at how these other venues can prioritize that.
As though the body starts from the neck down.
Right.
Instead of understanding we need health care also from the neck up. I'm a gun owner. Tim Walz is a gun.
I did not know that.
If somebody breaks in my house, they're getting shot.
Yes, yes. I hear that. I hear that.
Probably should not have said that.
Miley.
Hello.
Hi. How are you?
I am honored.
Say this with respect, you're kind of a show-off. It's like...
Those are obviously different vibes. Harris mixing that flavor with the journalistic interviews. And that brings us back to this major tradition in U.S. politics that I mentioned, a tradition that is journalistic, that is designed to be fair, to draw in the nominees from both sides in a similar forum for the kind of in-depth exchange that's different than debates or other things. I'm talking about 60 Minutes, where for many decades, the giants of network news have tried to show us and draw out and also press both parties' presidential nominees.
To have reached some sort of an understanding and an arrangement.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You're looking at two people who love each other. This is not an arrangement or an understanding.
I'm not sitting here as some little woman standing by my man like Tammy Wynette.
They think that Congressman Ryan's budget plan is just going to drive voters their way. How do you respond to that?
Well, what I respond is very simple, and that is America has a choice.
You don't have any doubts that you're ready?
No.
Where do you get all this confidence?
My wife asks me that all the time.
Is he tough enough to be president?
But is tough being nasty? Is toughness shouting and being ugly and trying to stick a knife in somebody? Or is it principle?
Your first statement was, are you ready for tough questions?
Are you?
That's no way to talk. There's no way to talk.
Leslie, one second.
At this point, one of our producers interrupted to advise about the time remaining in the interview.
I think we have enough of an interview here, Hope. Okay, that's enough. Thanks. I'll see you in a little while. Thanks.
Be careful.
When you invest in small businesses, you invest in the middle class, and you strengthen America's economy. Small businesses are part of the backbone of America's economy.
But pardon me, Madam Vice President, the question was, how are you going to pay for it?
Well, one of the things is I'm going to make sure that the richest among us who can afford it pay their fair share in taxes.
After initially accepting a request for an interview, the Trump campaign decided they would not participate.
That is the tradition, the past, bringing you all the way up to the present. Now, Donald Trump's campaign, initially, they said, accepted the request, presumably for the reason most candidates have. 60 Minutes reaches millions of people, and you wouldn't want to cede the turf and the airtime to your opponent here in the home stretch. Yet after the initial acceptance, Trump's campaign backed out, which means tonight, millions upon millions of people will be seeing only Harris and not Trump. So why? Well, Trump's campaign admits the journalistic fact-checking was part of the reason they don't want to do it, which is striking. And I want to be as clear and fair as possible. Campaigns, government officials, they can choose how to do press. There's no requirement or rule or law here. And they can have their own views over who's fair, what topics should be emphasized. And there are many valid debates over all of that. If you deal with people who have experience in this area, we can explain how all that works. But here, the Trump aides are not even claiming some valid reason or concern about topics or something that, again, people could debate. They just admit they're worried about the facts themselves. Just like they complained that there was too much fact-checking in the single Trump-Harris debate this year. The MAGA movement treats lying for Trump now as a litmus test. Lying about the last election, maybe lying about the next one. And it's gotten to the point, Fox News, of course, by broadcasting those type of lies, ended up on the losing side of a massive defamation case. All of this is steeped within what else is going on. J.D. Vance himself admitted in front of the whole nation at his only debate that he opposed fact-checking, and the rules were negotiated differently in that debate, again, to be as fair as possible. But whatever the rules said, when a candidate admits in public that fact-checking or the entry of facts into his claims would be bad for him and his campaign, bad for the Trump-Vance ticket, that is gobsmacking. That is not normal. That hangs over all of this and tonight's announcement here from 60 Minutes that the Trump folks are afraid to put him in a forum where he can be fact-checked. As for the Vance admission, this weekend's SNL turned that obvious flag into a punchline. Democrats ended up with their nominee later than ever this year, which means the remaining time matters more for persuasion than usual. Donald Trump is still trying different ways to draw attention, including what the internet is now calling the Elon leap, as the giddy billionaire leaped with joy behind Trump there at the rally at a site where he, thankfully, avoided that assassination attempt. Musk is a big ally, but the PR-conscious Trump may not have liked all the press and memes that came out of this. Here's how some of the rally played out.
We're going to boom like we've never boomed before.
As you can see, I'm not just MAGA, I'm dark MAGA.
We will reach Mars before the end of my term. Elon promised me.
And honestly, you want to just be a pest. Just
teleprompters are very dangerous because they go off a lot. You have to be prepared for them to go off.
Be a pest to everyone you know, people on the street, everywhere. Vote, vote, vote.
The mood was jocular at times. Trump fans may feel they're in on the joke. Musk used to have less love for Trump, but now he thinks the guy might be president. Now, I want to show you how something is widely seen in the U.S., X, Twitter, as a less credible platform than it used to be. It's also a business disaster. That's just what Musk has done there. He also attacks free speech. I can tell you today he lost an effort to try to get the Supreme Court to avoid subpoenas in the Jack Smith probe. Musk's track record here is just not that great. But in Musk, Trump has found something of a safe space. This is a campaign that Trump increasingly conducts inside a kind of MAGA bubble. And the rally I just showed you had these meandering, kind of confused digressions, which often collided with logic. Trump's age and possible cognitive decline is being covered in the New York Times head-on, noting he uses more negative words than positive, an indicator of cognitive change, and they have the percent on that. Also 13% more all-or-nothing terms. Uses swear words 69% more frequently. That is a trend that it can be called, according to experts, disinhibition. So take a look at Trump in 2016, whatever you thought of his ideas and his approach, but at a cognitive level versus, as the Times pointed out, how he sounds now. The evidence shows the shift, but whether people are seeing this is a separate question. Trump himself holding many fewer rallies than his first campaign. You can see the comparison there. It is a huge change and suggests even Trump's hardcore fans who would show up for a rally are less likely to see him in this condition. So the question becomes, who is hiding out from the real questions, to cite those Republican talking points I mentioned? Yet again, part of the attack is projection. And what's happening tonight on 60 Minutes might matter just as much as what's not happening. Donald Trump ducking another independent forum.
We will begin with former President Trump, who on Saturday returned to the site of the first assassination attempt against him. Now, during that rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, he and his allies accused Democrats of trying to kill him.
Over the past 8 years, those who want to stop us from achieving this future have slandered me, impeached me, indicted me, tried to throw me off the ballot, and who knows, maybe even tried to kill me. You know, I always say there's an enemy from within and there's an outside enemy. And if you're smart, the outside enemy is not going to be a problem. Russia, China, North Korea, we're not going to have a problem if you have a smart president. If you have not such a smart president, then it's a problem. But we have an enemy from within, which I think is much more dangerous than the outside enemy.
First, they tried to silence him. When that didn't work, they tried to bankrupt him. When that didn't work, they tried to jail him. And with all the hatred they have spewed at President Trump, it was only a matter of time before somebody tried to kill him.
And then, guys, they tried to kill him. They tried to kill him. And it's because the Democratic Party, they can't do anything right. They can't do anything right. You see it this week in the FEMA response in North Carolina, and in Georgia, and in South Carolina, and in Florida.
This is a pivotal moment for our country. And I don't even have to tell anybody that here. We can all feel it. This is no longer a fight between Republican versus Democrat, left versus right. It is good versus evil. And good is going to win this battle, ladies and gentlemen.
The level of un-American activity that you just saw is stunning. That is un-American. They know they're lying. Donald Trump knows that's a lie. He will tell you that the Secret Service, he thought, did the best job they could do. The fact that J.D. Vance and Trump's family would out and out say what they said takes the threat of violence, takes the threat beyond where it was even leading up to January the 6th. This is an increasingly desperate person, an increasingly desperate family who's preparing for civil war. They just are. Talking about they're trying to kill him. Democrats are trying to kill him. This is it, and the lies. Think about this. I saw part of Donald Trump's speech this weekend. It was remarkable, the lies, not just on things this year, but even on policy. He'd just make up things and just throw it out there. And I'd be shocked if the audience was really that stupid to believe the crazy lies that he was throwing out there. But he does it so much. It is the falsehood, the firehood of falsehoods. But they continue lying about 2020. Vance continues lying about 2020. Trump continues lying about 2020. Senators will not say on Sunday news shows that Donald Trump lost in 2020, despite the fact Republican officials in every one of those states that mattered said that, yes, in fact, Donald Trump lost. Brian Kemp said it in Georgia. Republican officials said it in Michigan. Republican officials said it in Pennsylvania. They said it in Arizona. They have said it repeatedly. Trump and Vance lying about people of Ohio eating dogs and cats. And yet the governor of Ohio, the Republican governor of Ohio, lifelong Republican, telling them to stop, that it is a lie. And now with the people of the Carolinas suffering in a way that only those who have gone through tragic hurricanes like Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Camille, and now this hurricane could imagine. Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Eric Trump, everyone else in the Republican Party, entire news channels out and out lying about what's going on the ground there, talking about civil war. It's staggering, just staggering when you have Republican governors from those states, Republican senators from those states, Republican mayors from those states, Republican county commissioners from those states, Republican officials from those states saying that they're doing great. In a tragic situation, they are coordinating very well with the federal government. Donald Trump, shame on Donald Trump. Show this Charlotte Observer headline. It's an editorial from the largest paper in the state of North Carolina. Shame on Donald Trump for worsening North Carolina's tragedy with political lies. And now the lie about Democrats trying to kill him. The lie about a person whose family had a Trump sign in his front yard trying to kill him, or the person who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, the lie that they were somehow part of a federal government conspiracy. They can't run on the truth because they're losing on the truth. And so the lies continue, and the lies get more dangerous, increasingly desperate tactics. It's unbelievable. Increasingly deranged talk, increasingly dangerous provocation, and perhaps a provocation that is preparation for his loss at the ballot box and a call for civil war. And let me tell you, there are hosts. In fact, there is a specific host on another network, the most popular host on that network, that has called for civil war, that has said, let's stop trying to figure this out at the ballot box. Let's move to civil war.
Great.
Does anything sound conservative about this? Because I spent this weekend going back through the books that I grew up on. Not this one. This one came out in 2013. It's Charles Krauthammer, who is an extraordinary conservative, a man that every conservative I respected just loved and respected. Also, a man who understood the danger of Donald Trump and warned about the danger of Donald Trump before he died. A man who won the Pulitzer Prize, who may be the great conservative mind of our time, that Donald Trump called I think, quote, dummy. With all this talk this weekend and this desperate move towards a civil war if they lose at a ballot box, I went back and I reread Peggy Noonan, Charles Krauthammer, The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, Edmund Burke. And I will tell you, for people that are trying to find the permission structure who claim to be conservative vote for this man, you cannot find it. You cannot find it in 240 years of conservative writing. You cannot find that justification for any writing before Donald Trump's rise and the right's capitulation to him. Charles Krauthammer wrote in his introduction to Things That Matter, and explaining why he stopped being a psychiatrist and began writing columns. In the end, everything lives and dies by politics. You can have the most advanced of cultures, get your politics wrong, and everything stands to get swept away. And everything stands to get swept away. And Krauthammer concludes by saying, this is not ancient history. This is Germany 1933. The point applies even if this is not Germany 1933. The point applies if this is something not as savage as Germany 1933, but simply an autocrat who decides to be a dictator on day one, who decides to arrest all those who he doesn't like, to take news networks off the TV as he said he would do if they're not supportive of him, who's talked about assassinating generals that aren't sufficiently loyal to him, has complained to his chief of staff that his generals should be more like Hitler's generals. Of course, Hitler's generals tried to kill Adolf Hitler, but Donald Trump didn't know history, so he didn't know that. Whose own lawyer said in court he could use SEAL Team 6 to assassinate political rivals. And if he were president of the United States, he could not be arrested. Nothing conservative about this. I really do wish anybody that would try to justify a vote for Donald Trump, I really do wish they'd just read the introduction to Russell Kirk, A Conservative Mind, 7th edition. And I'll just read one line here. To general principles in politics, the conservative subscribes. These are principles arrived at by convention and compromise. These are principles arrived at by convention and compromise, tested by long experience and applied with prudence. And for those who would say, how could David French? How could Liz Cheney? How could hundreds of people who voted and worked for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, and yes, for Donald Trump, how could they vote for Kamala Harris? This is what Russell Kirk writes at the end of the introduction. Both the impulse to improve and the impulse to conserve are necessary to the healthy functioning of our society. Whether we join our energies to the party of progress or the party of permanence must depend upon the circumstances of our time. And add to this the fact that Charles Krauthammer all the way back to Edmund Burke, has written about how tyrants and dictators and radicals can tear down in one day institutions that took centuries to build up by compromise, convention, and prudence. Less than a month from now, there is a clear choice. And we saw yesterday we all watched football this weekend. We all had a wonderful time this weekend. Sometimes things come at us so quickly that we're numbed by it. Newspapers certainly numbed by it. People in TV that follow this every day numbed by it. We're numbed by it. Everybody's numbed by it. But mark this weekend on your calendar. This is the weekend that Donald Trump spread the virus in the heads of all of his supporters, as did his family, as did his vice presidential candidate. The Democrats plotted to assassinate him. John Heilemann, if there's been a more dangerous political strategy in the final month of a presidential campaign, I certainly can't even begin to imagine when it was or what it was. Tell us just how dangerous this new territory is that Donald Trump, Vance, and his family have put us as a nation.
Didn't correct her once, and they corrected me everything I said practically. I think 9 times or 11 times. And the audience was absolutely, they went crazy. Venezuelan killers, street gangs, occupying the town with MK-47s. I know that gun very well. I got to know it very well. I've become an expert on guns quickly.
The nuclear is the biggest single problem the world has, not global warming, where the ocean will rise 1/8 of an inch in the next 500 years. You know, these people are crazy. The biggest problem we have is nuclear warming.
So none of those things are a thing, but we'll get there. Hi, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. 29 days to go, folks, until Election Day in America. Voting is already underway in many places, and alarms are sounding at a deafening level now over the disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president and his increasingly disconnected from reality, rambling, difficult to track, downright disturbing public statements. Let the record show quickly it is an AK-47, not an MK-47. Nuclear warming isn't a thing. And as the New York Times points out, quote, the debate was held in an empty hall. No one, quote, went crazy, as Trump put it, because no one was there, end quote. Peter Baker of the New York Times writes this, quote, anyone can misremember, of course, but the debate had been just a week earlier at the time Mr. Trump made those remarks, and a fairly memorable moment. And it was hardly the only time Trump has seemed confused, forgetful, incoherent, or disconnected from reality lately. And so, given that Donald Trump is now the oldest major party nominee for president in history and would be the oldest president ever if he were to win, the New York Times did a comprehensive analysis of Donald Trump's public appearances and how they have deteriorated and morphed over time. They found this, quote, signs of change since Trump first took the political stage in 2015. Quote, he has always been discursive and has often been untethered to truth, but with the passage of time, his speeches have grown darker, harsher, longer, angrier, less focused, more profane, and increasingly fixated on the past. Quote, Donald Trump rambles. He repeats himself. He roams from thought to thought, some of them hard to understand, some of them unfinished, some of them factually fantastical. He voices outlandish claims that seem to be made up out of whole cloth. He digresses into bizarre tangents about golf, about sharks, about his own beautiful body, end quote. And you don't have to take our word for it or the analysis from the New York Times. You can listen for yourself.
I could have been sunbathing on the beach. You have never seen a body so beautiful. Much better than Sleepy Joe. They were like Rambos. It's like putting 1,000,000 Rambos. Good old Sylvester Stallone is my friend. But it's like putting 1,000,000 Rambos. Somebody explained that to me. They'll bring in a big actor and you look, you say, oh, he's got no muscle content. He's got no muscle. We need a little muscle. Then they bring in another one. But he's got a weak face. He looks weak. Oh, there's a fly. Oh, I wonder where the fly came from. See, 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had a fly up here.
And while none of us will ever unsee that mental image of Donald Trump sunbathing at the beach, this analysis by the New York Times raises an urgent question for voters less than a month out from the election, a question about his, among many, many other concerns, about his cognitive ability and basic competence. One study cited by the Times found this, quote, Mr. Trump's speech complexity was significantly lower than that of the average president over American history. The Times analysis found that, quote, Mr. Trump speaks at a fourth grade level. Again, significantly lower than other modern American presidents. 29 days to go. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker, is here. He is bylined on that rather stunning piece of reporting. With me at the table for the hour, former Assistant U.S. Attorney and President of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Maya Wiley's here, and distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude, is here. Peter Baker, take us through what you've reported.
Well, I mean, you've done a pretty good summing up of it, Nicole. Thank you very much for reading some of the article. But I think we wanted to go back and look at the questions about Trump's age, in part because I think they were obscured for a long time by questions about Biden's age, right? Of course, President Biden, 3 years older, he presents physically in a more frail way. He had trouble walking. Obviously, people saw that debate. He kind of seemed to freeze up at times, had a hard time speaking. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues also with former President Trump, who's 78 and would be 82 at the end of his second term. Now, he doesn't present the same way, obviously, as President Biden. He does seem to have more energy. He does seem to speak more loudly and bombastically. But if you listen to what he's saying, which is what I did for the story, go back and watch rally after rally, speech after speech, especially going back 10 years, you really see a whole different, way of communicating. It's a much more accentuated. You use some of the statistics. Uses much more all or nothing language. Uses more negative words than positive words. He's speaking twice as long as he did when he first got on the stage 8 years ago, 9 years ago. His rallies, he's doing fewer of them, only about 1/4 as many as he did in 2016. And he's using a lot more profanity. One of my favorite statistics from our study was that he uses 69% more curse words today, which some people might recall is a sign perhaps of something called disinhibition. That's what the experts call it, disinhibition, when you lose your inhibitions later in life. So it seemed important to us to take a look and see what consequences we can see, if there are any, of age on, former President Trump.
I mean, disinhibition is an interesting word. It correlates with a lot of other age-related degenerative conditions as well. It's fascinating. I just want to ask you to say a little bit more about the extraordinary effort that's undertaken here. And I know that in the climate in which we all operate, there's been a real appetite, probably since the summer, to see this kind of reporting. And I think when the Times does something, they go deep. I want to read some of those numbers that you just shared with us. Quote, according to a computer analysis by the New York Times, Trump's rally speeches now last an average of 82 minutes compared with 45 and 16. Proportionally, he uses 13% more all or nothing terms like always and never than he did 8 years ago, which some experts consider a sign of advancing age. Similarly, he uses 32% more negative words than positive words, compared with 21% in 16, which can be another indicator of cognitive change. And he uses swear words, as you just said, 69% more often than he did when he first read, a trend that could reflect what experts call disinhibition. I wonder if you could take all that data and what you see and mash it up against the moment where you've got this disinhibited person spreading lies that endanger the lives of people living in hurricane zones.
Well, I think that's a good point in the sense that, look, disinhibition might be one thing if it's your father or your grandfather or your grandmother or so forth, when you're talking to them about what they can do in retirement. What we're talking about here is, of course, the most powerful position in the country, if not the world. And you're right, disinhibition, if it results in more falsehoods or lies or misleading statements has real consequence, right? We see that, as you say, in these hurricane zones where misinformation right now is confusing a lot of residents. They're being told things that are not true about migrants, about federal aid, and so forth. And it's muddying up the waters, if you will, about what really needs to be done to help people down there. And that's something that obviously voters will or will not take into account as they choose to. And it is true, of course, that former President Trump, has long been, a discursive speaker. It's not new in that sense, but it does seem to be more pronounced as he is getting older.
Let me read one more quote from someone familiar to our viewers. This is Anthony Scaramucci in your piece. Quote, "He's not competing at the level he was competing at 8 years ago. No question about it," said Anthony Scaramucci. Quote, "He's lost a step. He's lost an ability to put powerful sentences together. You can like Trump or hate Trump, but he's been a very effective communicator. But now the word salad buffet on the Trump campaign is being offered at a discount. You can eat all you can eat, but it's at a discount." It correlates with Fox News not airing him live as often as they used to. Any reporting or sense that there's any awareness of that or effort to rein him in or tighten this up so that they can have those platforms again?
Well, look, I think his campaign advisors certainly understand that. That's why they want him to be more disciplined. They want him to follow the script more. That's just not going to happen. That's not the way he rolls. He's made that very clear. But it is interesting. You're right. I don't think a lot of Americans watch the rallies as much as they used to because they're not shown on TV as much. They're not shown at length as much. And when we pull them out for news reports or for news, stories in the newspaper, we tend to pull out a small segment of a quote or something like that to get across whatever he's trying to say, rather than the longer, more impactful impression you might have if you watch it at length. And it's a reminder that there is a value to actually seeing a full-on presentation by a politician or a candidate, not just what the filter, ends up screening for our information. We need to be engaged as voters to see what's out there and to make our own judgments.
Joining us now is NBC's Dasha Burns, who covers the Trump campaign. Maya Rupert is former senior advisor for the Elizabeth Warren presidential campaign. Good to have both of you here. So, Dasha, what do we know about what Trump would actually do on abortion if elected?
Well, Chris, not a whole lot, in large part because he's been kind of all over the place on this issue. He continues to tout that he helped overturn Roe versus Wade, that he's proud of that. At the same time, he's been posting things on social media like that he's going to be great for women and their reproductive rights. He claims he wants to make IVF free for all Americans, but has provided very few details since he made that announcement on how he would actually do that. He recently said that he would not sign an abortion ban into law at the federal level after waffling on the issue for many, many months. And then you had his wife, Melania Trump, come out with that black and white video saying that she's in support of reproductive rights. And here's what she said in a recent interview about that.
Yes, he knew my position and my beliefs since the day we met. And I believe in individual freedom. He let me be my own person, and he respects that, and I respect that as I let him be his own person. He has different beliefs, and he will do what he believes.
And Chris, he keeps trying to moderate, but then you have things like what you just played from his running mate, J.D. Vance. The Republican Party is not necessarily singing from the same songbook on this issue, and the Harris campaign is having a field day with this issue and some of the past things that both former President Trump have said and other Republicans, and things like Project 2025, whether it be in ads or in recent interviews, like Harris hammering him on that on a podcast, Call Her Daddy, this week.
Dasha, thank you for that. So, Maya, how should the Harris campaign take advantage of what seems to be conflicting views by the Trump campaign over abortion?
I think they should keep doing exactly what they're doing, which is to point out these are more than just conflicting views. He is lying. What is happening right now is that Donald Trump is trying to sanitize what his actual position on abortion access. He has been bragging about overturning Roe versus Wade. The reason that we are in the position that we are in around IVF, around people's access to the health care that they need, because it is health care, is because of him. It is his direct actions. And calling it, letting him sort of get away with this, it's conflicting or it's mixed messaging. I think we actually are trading away what is maybe the most important point here, which is that he is making it actually very clear where he stands on these things. And I think he has got to be held to account. When he says, I won't sign a national abortion ban into law, that is actually missing the point. The next presidential administration is going to deal again with the issue of medication abortion. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't reach the merits. And they essentially said, come back when you have somebody withstanding. We're going to see another one of those cases. And unless Donald Trump says, I will direct my Department of Justice to defend the FDA and defend access to medication abortion, which is the #1 way people actually access abortion, he is saying that he will support a nationwide ban, and he needs to be held accountable for that. So until he can say that unequivocally without waffling, he is actually giving the clearest indication possible of exactly what he's planning on doing around access to abortion care.
We keep talking, Maya, about the election being, decided on the margins. Georgia is one of those places, and we just learned what happened there, that the abortion, 6-week abortion ban, essentially, is back in place. So anybody who has an appointment after 5 o'clock today, this afternoon, it no longer is operational, and it has to go through, according to our legal correspondent. Lisa says that, you just have to wait till all of those appeals have gone through. Right. Is that the kind of thing, bringing that back in a very real way onto the laps of voters, essentially, you think could have an impact?
Absolutely. I think that what's going on in Georgia, what's going on across the country, but I think there's a really clear and devastating illustration that's happening in Georgia right now, that there is a 6-week ban in place that effectively, for a lot of people, 6 weeks is not. There are people who do not know that they are pregnant within 6 weeks. This is essentially a complete ban on abortion in Georgia, and it will be in place until these appeals go through. Those are real women, real health issues. We have seen already out of Georgia just devastating news of people. We're losing people because of this ban, and that is directly because of Donald Trump. And if he is bragging about getting rid of Roe versus Wade, he is bragging about the conditions that women in Georgia are going to be met with when they are trying to access the health care that they need.